Ladies and gentlemen, this is TVP World. I'm your host, Benjamin Lee, and welcome aboard the Eastern Express. In this episode, we're diving into a geopolitical dance featuring none other than China's Xi Jinping and Russia's Vladimir Putin. These two leaders in their recent Beijing rendezvous weren't just catching up. They were busy choreographing a new era of partnership, a duet aimed squarely at challenging the U.S. dominance. Yes, it's a new age of alliances, and today we're unpacking it all. As the two leaders figure out who can be more cordial to one another, let's begin with our latest report to find out more.
Vladimir Putin has visited Beijing. The visit marks Putin's first official travel abroad since securing his fifth presidential term earlier this year. His arrival in Beijing follows an interview with Chinese state media, where he lauded the burgeoning strategic partnership between Russia and China. During a meeting, both leaders have asserted their mutual commitment to a political solution to the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. The leaders emphasized their stance during a joint press conference, positioning themselves as proponents of a multipolar world order. Both leaders refrained from explicitly terming the situation in Ukraine as a war, opting instead to refer to it as a crisis. In upcoming discussions, Xi and Putin are expected to delve into various aspects of their bilateral relationship, charting pathways to future collaboration. The Kremlin announced plans for Putin to engage with Chinese Premier Li Qiang and participate in the Russian-Chinese Expo and Forum on International Cooperation in Harbin. Putin's visit comes weeks after U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken flew to China to raise concerns about China's support for Russia's military. That trip appears to have done little to dent Xi's deepening relationship with Putin. By picking China for his first foreign trip since being sworn in this month for another 6-year term, Putin is sending a message to the world about his priorities and the strength of his personal ties with Xi.
And now let's take a look at the issue in greater detail. Now picture this, Xi Jinping rolling out the red carpet, literally for Vladimir Putin at the Great Hall of the People. Soldiers marching, guns saluting, children waving flags. It's a reception that screams, we're together in this. And this isn't just pomp and circumstances, it's a full-on display of unity against what they call the aggressive Cold War hegemon. Yep, that's the US, in case subtext wasn't clear. Now, let's rewind to February 2022. China and Russia declare a no-limits partnership, but only days later, Putin sends thousands of troops into Ukraine, sparking the deadliest conflict Europe has seen ever since the World War II. The timing? Questionable. The intent? Crystal clear. Fast forward to today, Xi and Putin's new pact is a broad rebuke of US foreign policy, touching everything from Taiwan to North Korea. But let's be real here. The harmony is less about peace and more about positioning against a common rival. Xi tells Putin that they're poised to drive global changes unseen in a century. That's ambitious, sure, but what does it actually signify? It means attempting to redraw the lines of global power that have been dominated by the United States for at least 100 years. And as they shake hands and pose for the cameras, behind those smiles, they're a serious play. Both nations are feeling the squeeze. Russia with its military bogged down in Ukraine, and China facing an American crackdown on its military and economic ascent. Their solution? Band together. Share toys in a sandbox, and maybe, just maybe, tilt the balance of power eastward. But it's not all rosy. There's internal drama too. Russia, traditionally the big brother, now finds itself leaning heavily on China, who's buying up Russian oil like it's going out of style. Meanwhile, the United States isn't just watching from the sidelines. They're calling out China's support for Russia as deeply problematic, criticizing Beijing for trying to play both sides, strengthening ties with Europe while backing Moscow's war efforts. And as the West slaps sanctions on Russia, Putin turns to China not just for moral support, but for economic survival. The message is clear. In this new era, Russia is betting big on China, hoping this partnership can shield it from international backlash. So, as Xi and Putin toast to their alliance, the world watches and waits. How will this partnership reshape global politics? Will it lead to a more multipolar world or just more tension? Only time will tell, but one thing is certain. The stakes couldn't be higher. And now, here to shed more light on the issue is Chris Morris from the University of Portsmouth. Hello, sir, and welcome to Eastern Express.
Good afternoon. Thank you for having me.
So we're trying to decipher Putin's visit to Xi Jinping in China. And of course, a lot of it is kept really hush-hush, and they do present a very economic front when it comes to this particular meeting. But we're also wondering whether or not there's anything more lying underneath all of that.
Oh, yes, absolutely. So when it comes to China and Russia, their relationship definitely includes economic aspects. But that's not where the relationship stops, if we're going to be blunt. And indeed, many of the aspects of this economic relationship are really there in terms of advancing both the ability of Russia to continue to fight its war and China to act as a destabilizing influence across the region and indeed across the globe.
All right, and Putin also brought his entire entourage with him to go to China. I think that didn't went unnoticed. And one of the things that we did see a pattern is during his reshuffle of his governance, most of the more pro-Chinese guys with stronger ties to China did not get replaced. Instead, the new defense minister seemed to be someone that has closer ties to China as opposed to the previous one. Do you think there's any significance in that?
Absolutely. Now, the relationship between China and Russia is absolutely pivotal for Russia's defense industry moving forward. China has proved adept at finding ways for Russia to effectively evade the very restrictive economic and it's very difficult for them to get control of weapons components and things that they need to fight their war. China has proved very adept at finding ways to evade these kind of paradigms, and as a result, it's an absolutely critical relationship moving forward.
All right, and first, we are seeing Russia acting as one of the backdoors to avoid sanctions for Russia, as well as, like you mentioned, getting these military components. However, I do believe that China does stand to benefit from trading with Russia, too.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Now, unmistakably moving forward, I think we're going to have to conceive of Russia as the junior partner in this tightening relationship. Yes, that not only can we think about the energy sector here, but, China is really gearing up globally to continue to act as a disrupting factor. And, strengthening this tie with Russia will give them a strong base to move forward and do things like, challenge America in terms of its own domestic industries. So yes, I do think we need to look on Russia as being the junior partner here.
Right, and also something that I do want to question you about, to put things into context. We did notice that this meeting was called by Xi Jinping to Putin. Do you think that's a coincidence, or is there something going on there?
Now, again, I think, yes, very much. I think, unfortunately, Russia is finding itself in an increasingly kind of restrictive geostrategic environment. It's partly that, Xi Jinping is willing to throw Russia a, I suppose, lifeline based on their common interests in disrupting the global, reality. And it's also, it's a clear signal that Putin is effectively going to be falling in line with Chinese policy moving forward.
All right. Do you think that would actually mean that Putin playing second fiddle to Xi Jinping, as he is now, like you mentioned, severely limited in how he can maneuver and has to rely on China for that lifeline?
Oh, yes, absolutely. There is going to definitely be an element of reliance moving forward. Again, Russia needs a market for its goods, in particular its energy sector, and it needs, again, that economic lifeline in terms of people that are willing to trade with it and willing to help it evade sanctions. China is the best market in this regard, and as a result, it's a natural partnership for both nations.
And speaking of that partnership, we do observe that China and Russia's relation a lot of times actually based more transactional than really ideological or having any friendship going on there, especially given that they do have a history of border situations, disputes when it comes to Central Asia regions. Do you think that this shift will give Xi more power over Putin?
Now, I suppose Xi does have this dream of kind of a multipolar world. Unfortunately for him, history does seem to have a way of throwing a wrench in it time and time again. So again, his idea is basically that, him and like-minded nations are going to basically work together and synchronize to effectively disrupt, in particular, American influence over the globe. Unfortunately, what generally ends up happening is that these nations end up competing at least as much as they coordinate activity against America. So whilst it's very much a marriage of convenience, and in terms of its long-term viability, all bets are off when it comes to that, I would say.
All right, and you mentioned their attempts at challenging America's dominance or the Western dominance of the world. Do you think that Xi Jinping's this recent European tour has something to play with that? The meeting with Emmanuel Macron, the meeting in Serbia, the meeting in Hungary. do that factor into this?
Oh, yes, absolutely. So Serbia and Hungary are absolutely pillars of kind of Chinese activity in Europe. Serbia in particular is incredibly close to China, massive economic investment, as is the case with Hungary. Now, France is a little bit more shocking, but China clearly does have an agenda when it comes to the French population. Now, one of the things that France is very keen on doing is, I suppose, it's moving away from America in many ways, building up its own security industry, building up a capacity for Europe to defend itself. So what Xi Jinping will be looking to do is effectively use this as an opportunity to limit coordination between nations like France and America and ultimately drive a wedge between the two.
All right, now there's a little bit of nuance I'm hoping that you can help me decipher as well, but given the timing of all these taking place almost simultaneously. And I'm just wondering, Xi Jinping's visit to Serbia and Hungary and meeting Vladimir Putin after that, do you think it's more providing a window for Russia to communicate with some of the European allies that say that can't be out in the open? Or do you think Xi is trying to kind of garner the support for himself?
That's an interesting distinction. Now, it's very interesting to see China occupying space in effectively what Russia likes to think of as its sphere of influence, its backyard, where it holds, or it believes that it holds, an awful lot of cultural and political influence over these nations. Now, China, if it's intelligent, might actually try and leverage this relationship in order to further its economic interests in these two regions. But again, I think moving forward, this is going to be an increasingly fraught relationship, particularly as China, by necessity, starts to, I suppose, infringe on what Russia sees as its interest in what it thinks of as its backyard.
All right, speaking of these unholy alliances, of course, we do know that Russia, China, as well as Iran, North Korea are coming into the mix in, again, potentially trying to overthrow the American or Western hegemony. Do you think that how credible do you think that threat is going forward?
Certainly cause for concern. It's never good to see these kind of nations to begin to coordinate activities. Now, China is in a very interesting position, and I would say it is undeniably the dominant partner. And it's probably the Chinese that we're going to need to watch if we're going to understand the trajectory of this phenomenon. Of course, what China is trying to do at the moment is kind of operate in what it thinks of as the gray zone. It's dancing very much from the South China Sea to Europe on the fringes of conflict. And it thinks this is a sustainable plan moving forward. It thinks it can continue to effectively tap dance on the edge of serious, real confrontation. Whether or not that's the case remains to be seen. It's also worth noting that many of these nations that China is aligning with, they can be disruptors of their own, and they do have their own interests. So, as is typically the case when China tries to forge an alliance, be it based around security or economic interests, I would expect to see a fair deal of fragmentation in the not too distant future.
All right, and speaking of one of these alliances, I would also like to ask you a little bit about the BRICS organization, because a lot of voices have been saying that the reason why China is so successful in garnering these sort of economic body is the fact that they are willing to kind of keep an eye closed when it comes to human rights violations or kind of just things that don't really jive well with their economic interests. They are willing to kind of put that aside, as opposed to the more Western kind of organization that kind of wags the finger at any trade partners that are potentially violating any human rights or environmental violations. Do you think going forward these Western alliances can compete with organizations launched by China, Russia, who just don't care about these violations?
Yes, absolutely. So one of the major constraints facing Western nations is, I suppose, what you could call, if we're going to be very low resolution, a commitment to the kind of the global international rules-based order. And yeah, China and many of its allies are not constrained by things like human rights and, international law, at least to a lesser extent than many Western nations. And this gives them some absolutely critical advantages when it comes to competition. Now, again, the US hasn't done itself much favors in the past, being perceived as the world policeman. And in many nations, you've got to remember, ideas like human rights are perceived as US or at the very least Western constructs. What China and Russia are capable of doing is effectively, in many national contexts, offering a model of what the world should look like that many nations are going to be more comfortable with. Yes, you've got to remember that many of the ideas around human rights and the rules-based international order do not enjoy global popularity, particularly once you move out of North America and Europe.
Right. So, what can the Western countries do to make sure that the organizations like BRICS or anything that China, Russia is trying to establish don't overtake them eventually?
Well, I suppose we could look to China and Russia's own tactics, again, so far as it is possible to do so within the framework of our self-imposed rules. And one of the things that we could look at doing is exploiting the friction that all too often emerges between BRICS companies. Again, whilst China is looking for collaboration on economic issues, more often than not, these nations do find themselves competing with one another. Their interests do not always align, and getting them to agree on, any matter is always going to be immensely complex. They are, again, each other's major competitors when it comes to industrialization and things like that. So as a result, again, I think that's a key aspect that can be exploited moving forward.
Right. And last but not least, speaking of these friction and something that can be exploited, of course, we do see this visit of Putin to China and Xi Jinping rolling out the red carpets, literally. I mean, at some point, there's more carpet than floor. But I would assume underneath that there is still some friction between the two.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. There is a massive history of discord between the two nations. Now, again, increasingly, we're going to be looking at, I suppose Russia is going to have to dance to China's tune on many of these issues. Of course, this is going to ostensibly perhaps even weaken Putin's domestic position in that he's going to have to make more and more concessions to China. Now, these two nations have found themselves in conflict in the past. For the moment, their interests align. And that's largely because they find themselves on the same side in this global era of competition. But the minute that pressure is removed or lessened, or they find more interest in competing with one another, I would expect that to once again start to be their dominant driving force in their international kind of decision making.
Right. Thank you so much for your input and insight and helping us compact this very complicated situation. Really appreciate it. And thanks again for being with us on Eastern Express.
Thank you so much. All the best.
And now we're moving on to the Eastern News Flash, a series of all the other stories from the East that you don't want to miss. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has called for the deployment of several additional Patriot air defense systems to safeguard the embattled city of Kharkiv. He has stressed the critical need for enhanced defensive measures to protect the city from further devastation.
According to media reports, the United States is planning to provide Ukraine with an additional Patriot system. This information comes from anonymous sources in the Pentagon. Recent days have seen a tragic escalation of violence, with hundreds losing their lives or sustaining injuries in the latest Russian offensive north of Kharkiv. Zelensky's visit to the region came as a surprise, but the president is known for his endeavors into combat zones in Ukraine. Despite the grim realities on the ground, there are signs of resilience. Zelensky announced that defense and security forces have partially stabilized the battlefield in Kharkiv region, providing a glimmer of hope amid the chaos. Additionally, a counter-offensive effort near the highly contested city of Vovchansk has been initiated by Ukraine's defense forces.
Russia has reportedly launched a satellite capable of destroying U.S. satellites, including those in the Starlink constellation. The satellite known as Cosmos 2553 was supposedly launched shortly before Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine.
While Russian officials have claimed that Cosmos 2553 is intended for scientific research and electronic testing, US officials have dismissed these claims as implausible. They believe that the satellite is actually carrying non-nuclear components of Russian weapon systems that could be used to destroy satellites in low Earth orbits.
My God.
If fully operational, this system could allow Russia to cripple US military capabilities by disabling satellites that are used for navigation, communication and early warning of missile launches. It would also pose a threat to commercial satellites such as those in the Starlink constellation, which are used by the Ukrainian military and civilians for internet access. The development of the satellite has been met with alarm by US officials, who have warned that it could represent a serious national security threat. In February, House Intelligence Committee chairman called on Biden administration to declassify all information related to the threat.
The parliamentary majority in Moldova has scheduled the presidential elections to coincide with a referendum on the country's potential accession to the European Union. This move underscores the majority's commitment to advancing Moldova's European integration agenda, a cornerstone of President Maia Sandu's administration.
Among the candidates vying for the presidency of Moldova is the incumbent head of state Maia Sandu, who has garnered both domestic and international acclaim for her pro-European stance and efforts to combat corruption and strengthen democratic institutions. However, the electoral landscape is not without its complexities. Opposition parties, particularly the socialist and communist factions, are mobilizing to field a unified candidate to challenge Sandu's bid for re-election. This concerned effort underscores the high stakes of the upcoming elections and the divergent visions for Moldova's future among its political elites. The referendum on EU accession, championed by President Sandu, has emerged as a focal point of contention. While proponents argue that EU membership offers economic opportunities, political stability and alignment with Western democratic values, opponents, including pro-Russian factions, decry it as a threat to Moldova's sovereignty and traditional ties with Russia.
Ilan Shor, the Moldovan oligarch who has been fugitive since 2020, has acquired Russian citizenship. Moldovan authorities have confirmed that Shor, who is currently under sanctions by the US and the European Union, now holds a Russian passport in addition to his Moldovan and Israeli ones.
Shor, sentenced to 15 years for his involvement in a $1 billion bank fraud, has been residing outside of Moldova, reportedly in Israel since the election of the pro-Western president Maia Sandu. His acquisition of Russian citizenship, which was not officially communicated to Moldovan officials, contravenes Moldova's laws that permit only dual citizenship. The Shor Party, which Shor founded and which has been known for its pro-Moscow stance, was dissolved by Moldova's constitutional court in June last year after being deemed unconstitutional. The party has been active in organizing anti-government protests aimed at overthrowing President Sandu's government, with Shor directing the protests remotely.
And that's all in this episode of Eastern Express. But for more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.